Charles, é uma honra dividir essa mesa com você, fazer essa entrevista com você. Na verdade, eu trabalhei bastante para te fazer muitas perguntas. Eu sou uma fã dos teus livros e acho que não sou só eu. No Brasil, você vendeu mais de 1 milhão de exemplares, o que é uma enormidade num mercado como o brasileiro. Então, uma alegria estar aqui, poder falar com você. Eu queria vou te apresentar, vou cometer a infâmia de te apresentar aqui para as pessoas. Charles é um dos grandes jornalistas e autores de não ficção do nosso tempo. Ele passou pelo New York Times, ele ganhou um Pulitzer em 2013. Acho que não é banal, eu nunca tive ao lado de um ganhador de Pulitzer. E hoje escreve para New Yorker. Ele é autor do Poder do Hábito, que é esse que eu disse que vendeu mais de 1 milhão de exemplares no Brasil, e que virou uma referência mundial para entender por que a gente faz o que a gente faz. E também, mais de 1 milhão de cópias só no Brasil, e o livro mais recente, Supercomunicadores, num tema que acho que todo mundo que está aqui vai saber e vai reconhecer, que é por que algumas conversas conectam e outras travam, mesmo quando a gente está tentando bravamente acertar, a gente erra rudemente. Então, queria começar te perguntando, Charles, prometo que eu vou ser rápida com minhas perguntas, tá? Qual que é a história sobre o seu trabalho? A gente estava conversando ali atrás, eu estava te contando um pouquinho de onde eu vim. Como é que você conta para os teus amigos o que você faz da sua vida? Como é que você fala?
It's a great question. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, good. So oftentimes I don't know what to tell them. and I just tell them, I wake up in the morning, I sit down, I write some words, and then eventually we get to put them into a book. And I think the thing that I've been working on, that I've been trying to do my entire career, I was a reporter for the New York Times, and now I'm a reporter for the New Yorker magazine, and I write these books. And my goal each time is to reveal to people the forces that influence our lives that we might not be aware of. When I was a child, my father was a lawyer, and one of the things, and he represented people who had been injured in accidents and people who had been injured by doctors. And what they realized is that there were these systems that influenced people's lives that sometimes hurt them or sometimes benefited them, but that we were all blind to. And so one of the reasons I wrote The Power of Habit was because I felt like there were these systems in our world, in our head, in our psychology, that we're sometimes unaware of. And as we become more aware of them, we have more control over them. Similarly, with communication, that learning how the rules of communication, how communication occurs inside our brains, that it helps us get more control over doing the things that are important to us. And similarly, when I was a newspaper reporter, I would write about of government, of psychology, of how those systems, the more power we have over living the lives that we want to live.
Charles, e onde você acha que a gente deveria aprender a conversar? Eu tenho sempre essa dúvida, porque é uma coisa que ninguém te ensina a conversar. Você aprende, é como é só a vida acontecendo, né? Onde a gente deveria? É escola, é casa, é trabalho? E onde é que a gente falha miseravelmente nessas conversas, em aprender a conversar?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the reason I wrote this book was because I got into this bad habit with my wife, where I would come home from work, and this might sound familiar to some of you. I would come home from work, and I would start complaining about my day. And I would say, oh, my coworkers don't realize what a genius I am, and my editor doesn't realize how, that I have all the right answers. And my wife would listen to me complain about my day, And she would give me some good advice. She would say something like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other a little bit better? And what I noticed is that instead of listening to her advice and hearing her advice, I would get even more upset. And I would say, why aren't you supporting me? Why aren't you outraged on my behalf? Does this sound familiar to anyone? Do you do this at home with your own spouses? Yeah, a couple of us, right? Like, this happens all the time. One of us starts complaining about our life, and the other person starts trying to give us solutions. Now, I'm a professional communicator, and I didn't understand why I kept falling into this trap again and again and again. And so I went to these experts. I went to these neuroscientists. And I asked them, what's happening? And they said, well, for the first time, we actually know what's happening inside your brain when you're having a conversation. Because we can see with advances in neural imaging. And they said, when you're having a discussion, you think you know what that discussion is about. You think you know that you're talking about your day, or you're talking about the kids' grades, or where ought to go on vacation next year. But actually, they said, if we look inside your brain, what we see is that you're having many different kinds of conversations all at once. You are having and in general, these conversations tend to fall into one of three buckets. There's these practical conversations where we're solving problems together. But then there's emotional conversations where I tell you what I'm feeling, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize with me. And then finally, there are social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other, how we relate to other people, the identities that are important to us. And one of the things that they told me, and this gets to your question you asked, is that oftentimes we don't learn how to have these different kinds of conversations, right? We might get very good at practical conversations. We might get very good at solving problems. And so when our kids come to us with a problem, we give them advice and we tell them what to do. But we're not as good maybe sometimes at the emotional conversation. And so they don't feel like we're listening to them. They don't feel like we understand what they're experiencing. Or maybe we're very good at the emotional conversation. But when someone comes to us with a problem, or when someone comes to us and they need to be seen, they want to have a social conversation, we're less practiced at that. And so the goal of Supercommunicators was to explain to people these different kinds of conversations, how to recognize them, and how to match each other. Because when we can have the same kind of conversation at the same moment, that's when we feel connected to each other. And so I think that we learn it at work, we learn it at home, but we learn it almost unconsciously, and this was an attempt to make it more deliberate and more conscious.
Charles, você sempre foi apaixonado pela ciência? Você deu um pivô na vida, né? Assim, você saiu da comunicação diária, vamos chamar assim, para ir ouvir cientistas e entender esse tipo de funcionamento. A ciência estava na tua vida desde sempre?
Very much. So my wife is a scientist. She's a marine biologist. And I grew up, when I was a young adult, probably like many of you, there was this scientific revolution happening. Behavioral economics, the social sciences becoming real sciences, getting evidence behind them, getting science and experiments behind them. And that was very exciting to me because it felt like we could take these things that were intangible, things that were hard to put our arms around, like communication, like habits, and suddenly we could understand them as scientific topics. We could look to experiments that clever people had done and look at those experiments and learn from them. So that's when I sort of started to fall in love with science, was it felt like a way to take the things that are very ephemeral, that are hard to define, and to pin them down and help us understand how they actually work.
Queria te perguntar justamente sobre isso, porque no começo do Poder do Hábito, uma das personagens, quando ela está no Cairo, eu fiquei muito apaixonada por ela, porque sempre que a gente vai mudar um hábito na vida, você fala, eu preciso mudar tudo, eu vou mexer em tudo. E uma das coisas muda um hábito, então ela para de fumar. E essa parada de fumar faz com que toda a vida ande, né? Assim, queria te fazer uma pergunta que é, se a maior parte do que a gente faz todo dia, a gente está nesse automático, o que sobra que a gente pode chamar de escolha, Charles? O que é a gente na nossa própria vida?
So, what research tells us is that about 40 to 45% of what we do every day is a habit. It happens almost automatically. But what we've discovered is that, so about half of what you do is a choice, and about half is habits. But as soon as you recognize the habit, as soon as you identify the cue and the reward that's driving that behavior, the habit becomes very fragile. We can change habits very, very easily. And you had mentioned Lisa, the woman who stopped smoking and how it changed her life. Let me ask a question. How many people here exercise on a semi-regular basis? Okay. So on the days that you exercise, is it harder or easier to eat healthy that day? It's easier for healthy, right? It gets easier for healthy. Now, this doesn't make any sense. There's no reason why going for a run in the morning should make it easier to eat a salad instead of a hamburger at lunch. And in fact, these two researchers in Australia found that when you exercise in the morning, on that day, you're more likely to use your credit card less. You spend less money. You procrastinate less at work. If you come home and you have chores to do, like washing the dishes, on average, you'll start washing the dishes 20 minutes earlier in the day. Now, no one in this room goes for a run in the morning and says, oh, today I'm going to keep my Visa in my pocket because I went for a run. And yet, when we start a new pattern in our life, this exercise habit, it sets off a chain reaction. It changes how we see ourselves. These are known as keystone habits, and they're very popular. They're very powerful. And to your point, that's why giving up smoking allows you to start exercising more, allows you to start saving more money, allows you to train for a marathon like Lisa Allen did. So I think one of the things that's important is not only that we recognize the habits in our life, but that we recognize the keystone habits, these opportunities to make small changes that set off a chain reaction that change many other parts of our life and make change easier.
Tem uma história também no livro que eu fiquei muito encantada, porque é sobre a perda da memória. E a gente, nesse tempo, com redes sociais, etc., a gente tem falado muito sobre memória, o que fica na nossa cabeça. E tem coisas, obviamente, que de fato são doenças, enfim, questões. Né? Quando a gente perde a memória, mas o corpo continua, Charles, acordando, fazendo café, encontrando o caminho de volta para casa, por exemplo, se a gente não mora nessa memória, aonde mora isso tudo dentro da gente? Que lugar do nosso cérebro fica preservado? É uma pergunta, na verdade. Algo se preserva mesmo quando se perde tudo?
Absolutely. So there's a part of our brain, and it's not just our brain. Every mammal has this part of its brain that's known as the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia is one of the oldest structures in our brain. And its entire job is to create habits. It's to take those memories and make them into automatic behaviors. Now, what's interesting about the basal ganglia is that it can operate almost absent conscious thought. There are people who become amnesiacs, who cannot remember anything that happened 5 months ago. And they know how to find their way home if they go on the same route that they take every day. They know where to find food in the refrigerator if they're hungry. And if you ask them, where's the food? Where's the refrigerator? Where's the kitchen? They'll say, I don't know. I can't remember. But as soon as they get hungry, they walk into the kitchen, they take something out of the refrigerator, they have something to eat. That's because their basal ganglia is operating independent almost of conscious thought. This is very impressive. Without this, humans would have never evolved. In fact, no mammal would have evolved. If we can't form habits, daily life just takes too much attention. We don't have time to think about all the other things if we have to decide every single time we see an apple and a rock on the path. If we have to decide which one to eat and which one to put aside, it's just too much for our brains. Now, that being said, because the basal ganglia can operate almost unconsciously, that is why we do things that we wish we didn't do habitually. That is why even in the morning, you say, I want to eat healthy at lunch, and then you walk into the cafeteria and you get the same unhealthy lunch you get every single day. That's your basal ganglia. Or when your spouse comes and says something to you, or your kids say something to you, and you don't want to get angry, but you get angry, or you're short with them, or you don't pay enough attention. That's your basal ganglia taking over. And so as humans, one of the things that I think we have to do is we have to decide what we give over to the basal ganglia and what we want to grab back for ourselves, what we want to take away from the basal ganglia so that we can be the people that we want to be.
Charles, você, segundo a ciência, então, de fato a gente muda de verdade ou a gente aprende a contornar os maus hábitos ou, enfim, hábitos em geral? A gente consegue mudar ou a gente contorna só?
Yeah. No, we absolutely can change our habits. So the most important aspect of understanding habits, I mentioned it before, is every habit has three components. There's a cue, which is like a trigger for an automatic behavior to unfold. Then there's the routine, which is the behavior itself, what we think of as the habit. And then every routine delivers to us a reward, whether we're aware of it or not. When you back your car out of the driveway on autopilot without thinking about it, there's a little reward that emerges in your brain as soon as you make it into the street, a little dopamine release. Now, you might not realize that reward is happening, but your brain knows that reward is happening. So the question is, how do we change habits? Well, the first step is we have to figure out what the cue is that's triggering this behavior, and we have to figure out what reward this behavior is delivering to us. Sometimes it's obvious. I like to eat hamburgers because they taste good. But sometimes it's harder. When my kids interrupt me and I get angry, what is the reward there? Well, oftentimes the reward is that I feel a sense of control. I feel a sense of being able to set them aside and not be distracted by them. And it's only once I recognize that reward and I say, I understand that my brain experiences a reward when I'm short with my kid, when I ignore them. It's only then that I can change it. But I can change it. The change is real. There are people who, in this world, today had the last alcoholic drink they will ever have. And they'll never have another alcoholic drink. There are smokers who will give up cigarettes today and never smoke another cigarette. Those are real habits. They're habits that are hard. But there are people who will change, and they will stay changed their entire life. And it's not because we're working around it. It's because we're understanding ourselves. We're understanding the cues and the rewards that drive our behaviors. And by understanding those, we get the ability to change.
Charles, existe o Brasil, por exemplo, é um país que tem uma diferença de classes muito grande, de tempo, né? Então, o Brasil tem, por exemplo, São Paulo, algumas pessoas levam 2 horas para irem de deslocamento de um lugar para o outro para trabalhar. 2 horas para ir, 2 horas para voltar, etc. O que a ciência diz para pessoas que têm menos margem para poder mudar hábitos, né? De tempo, de grana, de energia. Como é que a ciência responde a essas pessoas?
So it's a very good question, because you're right. Even if we have knowledge of our own brains, even if we have control over our choices, our environment shapes our choices, the choices that are available to us. How many people in this room have commuted over 2 hours in the last week? A lot of us, right? The last time I came to Brazil, it took me almost 3 hours to get from my hotel to the airport before my flight took off. The flight itself was only 9 hours long, so to the United States. So the car ride was in some ways almost as a third of the time of flying home. And the truth of the matter is, there's very little we can do about that, right? We can try and change our lives. We can move closer to our work. We can say, I want to work from home. I want to have more remote work. But when the traffic is bad, the traffic's going to be bad. But what's interesting is how we spend that time when we're commuting. So there's been a lot of studies that have looked at when people are commuting in their car, what do they think about? It turns out many of us, we think about how unhappy we are commuting, right? We think about, oh my gosh, this is taking forever. This guy just cut me off. That guy's a jerk. I'm going to be late for work and I'm anxious about it. But there are some people who work on their mental habits as they're driving. And they have a gratitude practice. They have a kind of meditation practice. Or maybe they listen to audiobooks, or they listen to podcasts. And what we find is that those people who make choices to spend that time rather than being angry at the commute, rather than thinking about the commute, people who deliberately choose to think about other things, the commute is easier for them, but also it feels shorter to them. And so I think you're right. We can't fight the environment sometimes, right? We can't fight the economy. We can't fight what's happening in the world, and the world is crazy right now. But what we can do is we can take control of our mental habits. And we can say, in these moments, when I feel so frustrated, I'm going to have a meditative practice. I'm going to think about all the things that I'm grateful for. I'm going to think about my next vacation and make plans for it in my head. We have control over what happens inside our own skulls. And when we take control over that, not only are we happier, but we live longer. We often are more successful. And more importantly, it's easier for us to connect with other people and to find a community.
É sensacional pensar que o truque ele está dentro da cabeça nesse sentido para você tentar barrar o que as redes sociais chamam dos pensamentos intrusivos, virou uma moda das redes sociais, né, Charles? Isso, e a gente está lidando com um vício que talvez os nossos hábitos não tivessem prontos para essa quantidade de informação que a gente hoje tem que absorver por dia, né? Então, hoje, quando você lida, por exemplo, as pesquisas hoje, elas já conseguem contemplar, e eu sei que, óbvio, o Jonathan Haidt e várias outras pessoas falando sobre esse vício em dopamina, etc. Como é que faz para a dopamina também deixar de ser esse hábito e a gente conseguir, por exemplo, assistir uma palestra sem pegar o telefone?
Yeah. So let me ask, how many of you check social media at least a few times a week? Okay. Do you feel better after you check social media or worse? How many people feel better? How many people feel worse? One person. Yeah. Most of us feel worse, right? So why do we do it? Why do we check social media? Well, it's because in the moment, it's interesting, right? It's only after an hour that you think to yourself, I just wasted an hour watching TikTok videos of people singing Elvis songs or people riding their skateboard. This does not help me in life. I don't know why I wasted an hour doing this. But in the moment, it's entertaining. It's distracting. It brings you novelty. And you know what? That is okay. The problem here is not social media. The problem is trying to deny ourselves novelty and interest and the things that we enjoy. So when it comes to, does anyone meditate? Anyone? Okay. So I have tried to meditate so many times, and it's so boring.
Me too.
Yeah, it's so boring. I have such a hard time with it. I do not enjoy it at all. So here's what I do. When I sit down to meditate, I have one rule for myself, which is I get to think about anything I want to think about. I know I'm supposed to empty my mind. I know I'm supposed to be at peace, but instead what I do is I think about something funny that happened yesterday, or I think about what I'm going to write later today, or I think about the vacation I want to take next month. I give myself the novelty that makes meditation okay. And what's surprising is that over time, I've gotten better and better and better at meditation. It used to be that I had to think about 1,000 different things. And now I think about one thing, and then I find myself kind of in this just contemplative state where my mind does go empty. Sometimes we try and force ourselves to become the people that we want to be. But the truth is that when it comes to social media, when it comes to the things that we do that we feel bad about, it's okay to do those things. It's giving you something valuable. And now the question is, can you find a new way to give yourself that valuable thing? Can you find a new way to get that same reward from a different, healthier behavior? So now, whenever I have a rule that whenever I want to check social media, I have to read half a chapter of a book first. And of course, you never read just half a chapter of a book, right? I start reading the book, and then I'm like, oh, this is very interesting. And I've read half a chapter, and then I've read a full chapter, and then I've read 2 chapters. And then suddenly I don't really want to check social media anymore because it's too late. I got to go to bed. And then I read another chapter, and then I'm tired the next day. The key is to recognize it's okay to give yourself things you enjoy. It's a matter of finding the healthiest, best ways to give you those things that you want and need. And sometimes that's social media, and that's okay.
Charles, normalmente a gente nunca escuta ninguém dizendo assim, eu sou um péssimo ouvinte. Todo mundo acha que fala super bem. Como é que a gente faz? Como é que eu estou convicta que você está me escutando e você tem certeza absoluta de que eu não estou te escutando? Como é que faz para isso funcionar de uma maneira... Qual que é o sinal mais comum desse desencontro entre um bom falante e um bom ouvinte?
Yeah. So let's talk about what listening really is. Because we think of listening as, I'm going to close my mouth and open my ears. And that's the first step of listening, but that's not enough on its own. How many of you feel like, just in the last week, you had a conversation with someone and that person wasn't really listening to you? Yeah. Or they were just waiting their turn to speak, right? Yeah. This happens all the time. And we're suspicious of it all the time. So what do we do next? After we close our mouth and we open our ears, how do we prove to the person that we're listening? Well, there's been a lot of studies about this. I believe that you are listening to me when you repeat back what you heard me say, and when you add something new to it. So if I say to you, oh, you know, I went on a great vacation. I went to Hawaii. It was very nice. And you say, oh, you went to Hawaii. I remember you went to India last year. Was Hawaii better than India or worse than India? Were they similar? Now suddenly I believe you're listening very closely to me, right? Because you've shown me that you're paying attention. And oftentimes when we're listening, we forget to prove to people that we're listening. And there's actually a technique for this that they teach in law schools and business schools that's known as looping for understanding. It has these 3 steps. If you want to prove to someone that you're listening to them, you should start by asking them a question, particularly what's known as a deep question, a question that asks them about their values or their beliefs or their experiences. And that can sound a little intimidating, but it's as simple as if you meet someone who's a doctor, instead of asking them, oh, what hospital do you work at? Asking them, oh, why'd you decide to become a doctor? Right, that second question. Why did you decide to become a doctor? That's an invitation to them to tell you about who they really are, to talk about seeing their own parents get sick as a kid, about how important it is to them to help other people. Okay, so step 1, I ask a question, preferably a deep question, and then I listen to what they say. And then step 2 is I repeat back what I heard them say in my own words. The goal here is not mimicry. The goal here is to add something to what they've said. To say, what I hear you saying is this, and I just want to make sure I understand it, because it sounds like one of the things that you mean by that is that. So that's step 2. And most of us, once we become adults, we know how to do this, right? We do this intuitively. It's step 3 that I always forget to do. Step 3 is after I've repeated back what I heard you say, I ask if I got it right. Did I hear you correctly? Am I understanding what you're trying to tell me? Because in that moment, what I'm actually doing is I'm asking you for permission to acknowledge that I was listening. And if you acknowledge that I was listening, you become much more likely to listen to me in return. So when we have a great conversation, it's usually because both of us are speaking up. We're both saying interesting things, and we're both proving that we're listening. Listening is an active experience. And when we do that, when we match each other and we're having the same kind of conversation, when we believe that we're listening to each other, we experience what's known as neural entrainment. Our brains actually start to look similar to each other. And this causes us to feel very close. It causes us to feel connected. Even if we disagree with each other, even if we voted for different people, you love Bolsonaro, I love Lula, it doesn't matter. We feel close to each other because we believe that we're having a conversation with each other. We believe that we're both listening to each other. And that feels really good.
Charles, como é que a ciência diz que a gente sai de uma conversa que ela já deu muito errado, mas você está enterrado até o pescoço nessa conversa e você já não consegue mais sair? Como é que a ciência vê isso?
Okay, I'll tell you what I do. Let's say I'm at a party and I'm talking to someone and they're just like, they're going on and I want the conversation to end. What I say to them is I say, oh my gosh, this has been so interesting. I have to go talk to this other person. But before I do, let me ask you one last question. And then I make up the dumbest question possible. But what I'm doing is I'm saying to someone, we need to end the conversation, but you're so interesting, I can't help myself but ask you one more question. And it works every single time. Or sometimes you're in a conversation where you're asking question after question after question, and they're not asking you any questions back. Here's what I do. I stop and I say, I've asked you so many questions. Thank you so much. You must have a lot of questions for me. Let me take a break and give you a chance to ask a question. And here's what's fascinating. They do. They have questions for me. It's not that they aren't interested in me. It's that they're not good at asking questions. They're not practiced at it. They need my permission to ask me a question. I think people are actually much better conversationalists than we think they are. But sometimes they're just awkward. Sometimes they're unpracticed. Sometimes they don't know how to gracefully end a conversation. They don't know how to ask questions. And when we give them permission, not only do we make it easier for ourselves, we make it easier for them to be the good conversationalists that they want to be.
Charles, então, num conflito, você acha que pesa mais? A frase, o tom, o timing? O que funciona melhor no momento de um conflito forte e pesado? Nesse sentido.
So the thing about most conflicts is they are emotional conversations, but they pretend to be practical conversations, right? I come in and I'm talking about the budget, and I'm really upset because you haven't given me enough budget. Or I'm talking to my spouse and I'm saying, you didn't take the trash out, or I'm doing too much. I have to take the kids to school and you never take the kids to school. So I dress up conflict in practical language. But it's really an emotional conversation. What I'm really saying is, I don't think you're appreciating me enough. Or I'm hurt that you didn't ask me if I needed more time and if I minded taking the kids to school. Or on the budget, I'm really worried and anxious because if we don't get the budget right, I'm going to have to lay people off. And that's going to be awful for me. So in those moments, the most important thing we can do is we can start by acknowledging the emotions that we hear. We can match them and have an emotional conversation. We can say, listen, I see that you are really anxious. I see that you're upset. And you know what? You have every right to be anxious or upset or to feel unappreciated. And sometimes I feel that myself, and I know how hard that is to feel. So let's talk about that feeling before we talk about the practical question. And what often happens is that takes the sting out of the fight. It takes the sting out of the conflict. Suddenly, instead of us being on opposite sides of the table, we're on the same side of the table and we're trying to solve a problem together instead of fighting each other. But let me ask, does that work for everyone here? When you fight with your spouse or your partner or your coworkers, do you find that talking about the emotions first helps? No, doesn't. Yeah, it's for some people it does, and it's hard. I know that one of the things that's interesting about Brazilian culture, and you can tell me if this is wrong, is that there's more conflict aversiveness, right? People don't want to have hard conversations with each other. It's impolite. But oftentimes, when we acknowledge those emotions, when we say, it looks like you're feeling hurt, or it looks like you're feeling upset, tell me about that. Explain to me what you're feeling. It makes it easier to have conflict. It makes it easier to be truthful with each other. There's an expression I love, which is, it rhymes in English. When you're feeling furious, get curious. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, good. And so when we're feeling upset, when we're feeling mad at someone, if we just start asking them more questions, oftentimes the anger will kind of seep out of the conversation. And it's hard to remember to do this when we're upset. But that's when I tell myself, if you're feeling furious, get curious. It reminds me to ask more questions.
Excelente. A plateia pode mandar perguntas, pode mandar em português, tá? Uma pessoa mandou aqui em inglês, mas pode, se quiser mandar em português, também pode. Charles, a gente recebeu aqui uma pergunta da plateia, que em momentos polarizados como esse que a gente está vivendo politicamente, bastante nos Estados Unidos e bastante no Brasil nesse momento, como é que você consegue estabelecer alguma conversa, algum senso de uma conversação ali possível entre duas pessoas que acreditam em coisas opostas?
So in the United States, we refer to this as the Thanksgiving problem. We have this holiday, Thanksgiving, where families get together, and inevitably one person loves Donald Trump and another person hates Donald Trump, right? And you just think to yourself, I don't want to talk to crazy Uncle Gary. He's going to tell me that like lizard people run the government. He's just crazy. So what do we do? What do we do in that situation? I think the best thing to do is to ask them very honestly what they care about. Because Uncle Gary, he kind of likes Donald Trump, but if I ask him, Uncle Gary, it seems like you're really passionate about Trump. Like, tell me why. I want to understand why. All of a sudden, he starts saying things like, well, I feel like the elites look down on me. I feel like the economy isn't working for me. That there's no jobs for me. And so I like Donald Trump. That's why I like Donald Trump. Now, with the exception of the Trump stuff, the rest of it is all stuff we understand, right? We've all felt excluded before. We know what it's like to feel worried because we worked hard and we went to college and now it's hard to find a job and AI is taking over and we don't know what the future of the economy is like. We've all felt that. So now me and Uncle Gary, we have something in common. We know what it's like to be worried. Now his solution is to vote for Donald Trump, and my solution is to vote for anyone except for Donald Trump. But because we want to understand each other, because I show Uncle Gary that I really want to understand him, suddenly we feel like we can have a real conversation about the things that we do agree on. Can I ask a question? I imagine most of the people in this audience are people who are fans of Lula. Is that or on the left instead of the right? Is that fair? Yeah. Yeah. How many of you have relatives who love Bolsonaro? And what is it like to have conversations with them? It's terrible. It's terrible. You don't even have the conversation. You just avoid the conversation. Okay, so here's my challenge for you. The next time you see that relative, I want you to ask them, listen, I don't like Bolsonaro. I'm never going to vote for Bolsonaro, but I want to understand why you love Bolsonaro. Tell me what it is about him that makes you so passionate, that makes you proud. And I promise you that something they say will be something that you relate to. And that does not mean that you ever have to vote for Bolsonaro. It does not mean that you have to pretend you like Bolsonaro. It doesn't mean that you don't have to say, you know what, I feel the same way, and that's why I vote for Lula. That's why I vote for the left. But simply asking them to explain who they are and then listening and not trying to change their mind, not trying to convince them that they're wrong and you're right, just trying to understand. I promise it'll make that conversation better. And it'll make every conversation better. You don't even have to talk about politics after that. You can talk about what you're having for dinner and it'll go better. But can I ask, how many people agree? How many people think that's something that they can do? Okay. And how many are like, no, I'm never going to do that? That's okay too. It's okay. One word, okay.
Sim. Deixa eu te fazer uma pergunta aqui. Uma das coisas que você descobriu no teu trabalho, que o que faz um time, por exemplo, funcionar, seja um time de futebol, um time numa empresa ou, enfim, pessoas que trabalham juntas, não é só talento, né? É as pessoas se sentirem seguras para falar. Isso é a mesma coisa que faz uma conversa funcionar, Charles? É a segurança? E queria também emendar numa pergunta que é: existe um limite para essa vulnerabilidade?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Yes. When we're a member of a team and that team comes together, it's because we have psychological safety. We feel like we can speak up and people won't use our words as weapons against us. The same thing happens in a conversation. And you mentioned vulnerability. Vulnerability is at the core of why conversations work. But we tend to misunderstand what vulnerability is. In neuroscience and psychology, vulnerability has a very specific definition. It's a neural cascade that occurs inside your brain when you say something another person could judge. Now, it might be something stupid. It might be, I like Star Trek better than Star Wars. Or I'm cheering for, in the World Cup, I'm cheering for the US over Brazil, which is not true. I cheer for Brazil over the US. Brazil is a much better team. But I might say something to you that doesn't matter, that's unimportant. But when I say something that you could judge, my brain automatically pays very close attention to how you react. What I'm looking for is I'm looking to see, do you actually judge me? And if instead of judging me, if you refuse to judge me, if you say, I'm not going to judge you, even better, if you say something that I could judge about you. If you say, oh, that's interesting. I like Star Wars better than Star Trek. Or, I'm going to cheer for Brazil over the US team, but not Portugal. When I do that, what you've shown me is that I can trust you. When we express vulnerability in a conversation, when we say something that the other person could judge, and instead of judging us, they withhold judgment, and they share something about themselves that we could judge in return, and we withhold judgment as well, that is when suddenly we feel safe with each other. And we might disagree with each other. You might like your team and I like my team, or you might like your movie and I like my movie. But the fact that we have not judged each other, it makes us feel closer to each other. That's when we feel safe. And that's when we can really connect with each other. Because, of course, we don't have to agree about everything to connect. Everyone in this room, if you're in a relationship, you do not agree with your partner about everything, but you still love them because you feel safe enough to express who you are and know that they will not use it against you.
Você acha que a empatia é uma coisa que dá para a gente fingir, Charles? Porque em alguns momentos do livro tem um momento quando você fala, por exemplo, sobre carisma ou escolha de escuta, né? Assim, você pode ser uma pessoa carismática ou você escolhe escutar. Mas quando você faz isso, como é que faz para não ser mecânico e como é que não se finge empatia?
So I think if you pretend at empathy and you do it enough, you actually become empathetic. Right? If I'm trying to sell you a car, and so I start asking you questions about what you want the car for and what's going on in your life, I try to pretend at empathy. If I pretend well enough, it actually becomes real empathy. Right? Suddenly I want to help solve the problem for you. I still want to sell you a car, but now I suddenly know a little bit about who you are. The same thing is true of charisma. The most charismatic people They start by pretending to listen to you, and it doesn't work. And then they actually start listening to you. And that's when they become charismatic. You can learn empathy. You can learn charisma. Some people are born with more empathy and charisma. Some people are born with less. But all of us can learn it and get just as good as everyone else. Because when we try and pretend we're empathetic, we actually become empathetic. It's impossible to resist the pull of caring about someone else if you pretend that you're caring about them. There are some psychopaths who manage to do it. There are some people who can pretend and pretend and pretend and they never care. But I don't think anyone in this audience is a psychopath. And my guess is, even when you're talking to crazy Uncle Gary, even when you're talking to the Bolsonaro voter who's related to you, if you pretend to be curious, if you pretend to be empathetic, you will eventually become genuinely curious and genuinely empathetic.
Charles, e acho que aqui tem uma pergunta que acho que uma das pessoas da plateia mandou, muitas das nossas conversas hoje estão baseadas no ódio. Né? Não é do que eu gosto, é do que eu detesto sempre, né? Então, não é que eu não goste do Trump, mas é do que eu detesto toda a política é baseada nesse ódio, né? Então, o ódio das minorias, o ódio, enfim, diversas coisas. Como é que faz para estabelecer algum diálogo num cenário como esse, que junta um pouco com a pergunta que eu tinha te feito sobre a polarização? Mas eu acho que quando a gente está falando em ambientes familiares, por exemplo, ou ambientes de trabalho, as pessoas têm enfrentado, de fato, esse problema, que é eu tenho que lidar com alguém que não é que ela me diz que gosta de alguma coisa, ela simplesmente detesta outra coisa.
Yeah. It's hard, right? And it's hard, especially right now, because it feels like there's so much hatred around us. And the truth is, some people do not want to have conversations with us. Sometimes we go to some Bolsonaro voters and they do not want to actually have a civil conversation with us. And for those people, it's fine to say, okay, you don't have to have a conversation with everyone. You don't have to have a conversation with someone who doesn't want to learn about you. You don't have to have a conversation with someone who just wants to spew hate. But now the question is, what does this person actually want? Are they someone who just wants to spew hate? Or are they someone who is so frustrated that they don't know how to express themselves? In the US, we have a real problem with racism, right? I think Brazil is much better about race. Still challenges, but better in Brazil than it is in the US. Most of the people I've met who say racist things, they do not actually hate other races. They don't hate black people, they don't hate Hispanic people, they don't hate white people. They're just deeply, deeply frustrated. And they've either been taught to take out that frustration and that anger on a group, or they're lazy and they don't think about their own anger and they don't find better ways to express it and where to put it. But what I find is, once I give them the opportunity to explain why they're angry, to explain why they hate, what I find is that there's something there that I can connect with them about. And I can say, listen, you keep on blaming all of the problems on immigrants. But I look around, and the immigrants that I know are some of the hardest working people I've ever met. They're some of the most moral people I've ever met. And so I hear you saying that you're angry and you're upset that you can't find a job. But I'm just wondering, isn't there an immigrant you know who you like? And inevitably they say yes. We've all experienced this, right? We've all experienced someone who otherwise we would dislike, but we find something about them to admire. That's, I think, how we deal with hate.
Tem uma história que eu gosto muito, Charles, do William Ury, que é um gerenciador, um negociador de grandes crises, etc., que quando ele foi negociar com o Hugo Chávez na Venezuela, ele ouviu durante 3 horas o Hugo Chávez vociferando contra ele, gritando e xingando e falando. Depois de 3 horas dessa conversa do Chávez gritando, eles começaram a negociar. Eu acho quase da ordem do impossível ouvir alguém gritar 3 horas, coisas com as quais eu não concordo. Acho que eu preciso ler teu livro mais vezes para ver se eu melhoro nisso. Mas acho que tem um exercício aí do que você está falando. E eu queria um pouco... A gente está caminhando aqui para o fim. Eu queria te perguntar, você consegue aplicar o que você estuda? E qual que é teu melhor hábito? Eu queria te perguntar, se você me permite, qual que é teu pior hábito?
That's a good question. I'll do my worst habit first. I love sweets. I love eating dessert. So I eat so much dessert. I eat dessert all the time. But here's the thing. It's okay to have bad habits. I also like having a cocktail ever so often. And it's okay to have a cocktail ever so often. And sometimes my kids come up to me with a problem and I'm in the middle of writing and I don't listen to them. I say, okay, let me finish this and then we can talk about it. And I'd feel bad when I do it. But it's okay. Because I'm still a good dad the rest of the time. We all have bad habits. Having a bad habit does not mean you are a bad person. It's not a character flaw. What is actually strong about us is when we recognize that bad habit and we say, I want to make up for it. I'm going to eat desserts tonight, but that means I'm going to go running tomorrow morning. Or we say to our kids, I'm sorry I didn't listen to you. I was just super distracted. I was writing this thing. Let me make some space to listen to you now. And I want you to know that when you feel like I'm ignoring you, you can say, Dad, you're ignoring me. And hopefully that'll break me out of my habit and I'll pay attention to you. And I actually think you asked what's the best habit I have. The best habit I have is that when I make a mistake, I try and apologize immediately. And apologizing is a very humbling experience, right? Particularly if you're apologizing to your kids, or you're apologizing to your Uber driver, or you're apologizing to the person who was helping you at the grocery store that you weren't sufficiently polite to, you didn't say thank you to. But whenever I notice that I've done something wrong or rude or something that I'm not proud of, I apologize for it immediately and I try and make up for it. And actually, it feels very easy. It's not humbling anymore. It actually feels good to me to apologize. It feels like I'm a better person. And when I do that, I find eventually I stop doing that bad thing.
Charles, deixa eu te fazer uma outra pergunta que quando a gente falha, e você está falando disso, né? Assim, eu peço desculpas, etc. Quando a gente falha, é caráter, é neurologia, ou é uma terceira coisa?
I think most of the time when we fail, it's pride. All the mistakes that I've made in my life are because I was not humble enough. I thought I knew the answer, and I didn't actually know the answer. I didn't care about someone as much as I should have cared about them. And so I treated them unfairly. So the question is, how do we overcome these failures? How do we overcome this pride? And what we know from study after study is that the antithesis of pride is connecting with other people. When I try and connect with you, it's impossible for my pride to overwhelm me. It's impossible for me to ignore the things that I should see. So every time I meet with someone, my goal is to connect with them in some small way. Every time I talk to my kids, my goal, and this is hard with kids, as you all know, my goal is to connect in some small way in this conversation, to remind them that I love them and that they love me, that I'm listening to them, and that I'm sharing things about myself that I think they should listen to. I think the antidote to failure is just saying, I want to connect with other people. And what the studies tell us is that when we connect with other people, we become happier, we become healthier, we become more successful. We are a pro-social species. Connecting with other people is the most rewarding thing we can do. And so then, if you do fail, if you make a mistake, it's okay. Because you're surrounded by people who care about you and who you care about, and they forgive you for your mistakes.
Nas tuas pesquisas, Charles, você descobriu, você achou alguma coisa que você preferia não ter descoberto nessas pesquisas? Algo que você diz, putz, isso aqui não vai mudar, eu não tenho o que fazer com isso?
Trying to think. I don't think so. I think that everything that I've found, there's a beauty in finding the truth. The truth is that if you look at humans across history, across the nations, across the world, preferring people who look like you to people who don't look like you happens in every civilization. It happens in every person. Preferring people who believe the same things that you believe over people who don't believe that, believe something different, that is a natural instinct, right? Because we are a pro-social species, we create in-groups and we create out-groups. And anyone who's raised a child knows this, right? And there's a stage at which every child is a little bit racist or a little bit sexist or a little bit something that we don't like. And at that moment, as parents, we decide, am I going to allow them to live with that belief? Or am I going to try and teach them that that's not right, that it feels natural, but that we get to choose to overcome some of our instincts. We get to choose to be better people. We get to choose to listen to the better angels of our nature. So what I've learned is that we all have instincts to be selfish, to be mean. We have instincts to dislike other people, to demonize the people who believe things that are different from us. But alongside that, we all have the capacity to choose not to listen to that instinct. This is what's the most amazing thing about humans. There is no instinct we can't ignore. We can change any aspect of ourselves that we want. And so I'm always encouraged by these studies, because even when the studies reveal that we are selfish or that we are mean, they also reveal that there are people who have chosen not to be selfish, not to be mean, not to be racist, not to hate. Those people represent not just the best of us, they represent the capacity that all of us have if we embrace it and if we choose it.
Vou te fazer uma última pergunta. Eu queria só dizer que vamos ter uma sessão de autógrafos. Charles vai estar ali, Livraria da Travessa. Quero agradecer aos tradutores de Libras da Educalibras, sempre estão aqui com a gente nisso. E quero agradecer o Ramon de Barros, que está traduzindo o Charles para a gente também. E quero também agradecer, e eu esqueci de fazer isso no começo, falha minha, agradecer os tradutores também dos livros do Charles no Brasil, que sem eles não teríamos. Então, os Supercomunicadores, traduzidos pelo Cássio Arantes e Débora Landsberg. Espero ter falado certo o nome da Débora. E, espera aí, um segundo. Tradução do Rafael Mantovani no Poder do Hábito. Muito obrigada. Charles, se você pudesse deixar uma única coisa na cabeça de cada pessoa que está aqui hoje, na minha, o que seria? Para a gente tentar amanhã.
So let me start by just by saying thank you to all of you. I know that it's very cold right now for Brazil. Whenever I come to Brazil, it's usually in the winter in the United States, and I get here and I think, oh my gosh, the weather is so wonderful here. But now it's summer in the United States and it's winter in Brazil. So I appreciate all of you coming out in the cold. Thank you. The thing I would say is this. We are living during a difficult time. Right? It is a harder time right now than it's been for a long time. Maybe since World War II. Like the whole world seems uncertain right now. And I know that in the US and in Brazil, politics are very polarized. The economy is so uncertain. We have these things like AI that everyone says, it's going to change the world, it's going to make everything better. And other people say, it's going to destroy the world, it's going to ruin everything. And as a journalist, I've gone and I've looked at other periods of intense change like the one that we're living through. I looked at World War II. I looked at the Industrial Revolution, the Second Industrial Revolution. I looked at the period of the late 1960s when all the nations were changing. And what I found is that if you look at people's diaries during those periods, everyone is anxious. Whether they are successful or unsuccessful, whether they go on to be famous or no one has ever heard of them, everyone is anxious. But the people who do okay, the people who end up being successful, the people who make it through these hard times, in their diaries, they inevitably say, I had someone to talk to about my worries. I had someone to talk to about my anxieties. I had someone to talk to about what's going on. I had someone to celebrate with me when I heard good news. When we rely on other people, when we connect with other people, when we invest in other people, even when we invest in our relatives who want to vote for someone different, even when we invest in our coworkers who drive us crazy in meetings, we are helping ourselves. We are making the world a better place for ourselves and for our kids. So the thing I would encourage all of you to do is to find someone tomorrow who maybe you're not that close to and ask them a deep question. Ask them, you know, I noticed that you go to this one church. What is it about that church that you like so much? Or, I noticed that you've worked here for so many years. What is it about this company that keeps you here? Or, one of my favorite questions, when is the last time you cried in front of another person? This is a question that nobody ever wants to ask, but that has been studied again and again and again. If you ask this question, I promise you, you will have a wonderful conversation with whoever you ask it of. So I hope that you got a chance to connect with someone tomorrow. Thank you obrigado. Thank you so much for having me. This is such a treat. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you. Muito obrigada, Charles. Muito obrigada.
Obrigado.
Obrigada, gente. Boa noite.
Sejam todos e todas bem-vindos à Feira do Livro 2026.
A Feira do Livro é uma realização da Associação 451, da Maré Produções Culturais e do Ministério da Cultura por meio da Lei Rouanet. Patrocínio: Mercado Livre, Motiva e Prefeitura de São Paulo na categoria Ouro. Itaú e Laranjinha Itaú na categoria Prata. Apoio: Pinheiro Neto Advogados, Instituto Ibirapitanga, Enjoei e Companhia das Letras. Parceria institucional: Livraria da Travessa, Mercado Livre Arena Pacaembu, SP Livro e Museu do Futebol, junto à Secretaria da Cultura, Economia e Indústria Criativas do Estado de São Paulo. Apoio institucional: Embaixada da França no Brasil, Instituto Camões, Arco Educação, Ministério das Relações Exteriores do Uruguai, Instituto Ramon Llull, Gráfica Viena, Chambril, Quiro, Frida e Mina, Inside by Mediação Paulo e Higienópolis, Ernesto Tzurnik Advocacia, Ecoar, Arpa, Ovo e Bubu Restaurante. Parceria de mídia: 451, Folha de São Paulo, UOL, TV Brasil, Rádio Nacional, JC Deco, Piauí, Carta Capital, Mídia Ninja, Nexo, Gama e Publish News. Acompanhe a programação e cobertura completa da Feira do Livro 2026 no site da revista 451 e também nas nossas redes sociais, @a Feira do Livro. Viva o livro brasileiro!